Let's do one more full chapter here. Chapter 20. What
Sounds
haunts
good.
me. Is that cool?
Yeah, that sounds great.
All right. All right. So this is Jeremy Rothgushel and Greg McCarran with Antedote Deepcore Texts, reading from Iraq and the Politics of Oil: An Insider's Perspective by Gary Vogler, published in 2017 by University Press of Kansas. We are now turning from chapter 2 to chapter 20. What haunts me? Page 253. Quote, 4,489 sons and daughters killed, 32,223 troops injured. The costs to the United States for invading Iraq were huge. Some of those costs included 4,489 sons and daughters killed, 32,223 troops injured, not including PTSD, at least 134,000 Iraqi civilians killed, 150 reporters killed, 2.8 million people who either remain internally displaced or have fled Iraq, almost $1.7 trillion from the U.S. Treasury through fiscal year 2013, and an estimated $490 billion of benefits owed to war veterans. Footnoted. We achieved little to no benefit for these costs. Could we have been misled into believing that WMD was the noble reason for this war? Or was it just an excuse? Could the war have been partly undertaken for the wrong reasons? Could oil have been one of those wrong reasons? There was a hidden oil agenda, but certainly not the one that most Americans imagined. What haunts me is that I may have been an unknowing participant in a secret oil agenda. Our nation's second president, John Adams, was quoted as saying, quote, facts are stubborn things. And whatever may be our wishes, our inclinations, or the dictates of our passions, they cannot alter the state of facts and evidence, unquote. I knew several facts about unofficial oil agendas in 2003, but they did not seem important at the time. They seemed to be just distraction to our mission. Many more facts have come to my attention over the last couple of years. My opinion has changed. These new facts are the source of what troubles me. The biggest is the linkage between two unscrupulous quote-unquote deal makers and senior Bush administration decision makers. Specifically, Dr. Ahmed Chalabi was closely linked to the Bush administration neoconservatives. That is well known, but his promise to deliver an oil deal is not. One senior neocon was linked to the notorious quote-unquote king of oil, Mark Rich. Rich made billions of dollars trading in non-transparent Middle East oil deals. By the 1990s, he had been a symbol of unscrupulous oil deals for more than 20 years. Footnoted. The Chalabi oil deal was never consummated. Dr. Ahmed Chalabi's pre-war promises amounted to nothing more than a duping of those senior Bush administration decision-makers who trusted him. Chalabi deceived the neoconservatives about an oil deal, and they sold the Iraq War to America. Chalabi's oil promise played a role in the decision for war. Was it a significant role? This is what plagues me. It is human nature to remember the good things, the great experiences of life, and to disregard or file away the negatives, the bad experiences. As I look back over my time at the Pentagon and in Iraq supporting Operation Iraqi Freedom, I wanted to look at the positives. I enjoyed the wonderful times that I shared with great American patriots and newfound Iraqi friends. The interagency planning at the Pentagon brought together some of the best and brightest within our government. They were civilians and military. Most were still active, but many had recently retired from government positions. Several of those individuals were from the Washington, D.C. area, but there were also many brought in from outside D.C. There were some that were from the Department of State, Department of Defense, Department of Energy, Treasury, Department of Justice, and the CIA. They were a great group of committed Americans, and I was privileged to have served with every one of them. The movement into Kuwait and then into Iraq saw many new faces, but it matched the quality of Americans that I worked with at the Pentagon. My interfaces in theater with active duty military increased. I worked with old friends on active duty. Most were in senior leadership positions. My new friends were the young, bright, and energetic officers, non-commissioned officers, and soldiers that were the best that America had to offer. All of them were unselfish and dedicated Americans. No one bothered to ask them if we should invade Iraq, but they were doing their job. Phil Carroll's arrival in Baghdad in May 2003 was a personal highlight for me. Phil was an American oil industry statesman, a former senior executive, smart, articulate in his way, and above all, a patriotic American. Other great oil industry leaders and patriots followed: Rob McKee, Mike Stinson, and Norm Sidlowski. The United Kingdom added 2 retired oil executives, Terry Adams and Bob Morgan. Australia sent a government energy expert, John Kjar. We put together my version of the, quote, oil dream team, unquote, with these gentlemen and the U.S. government civilians and military. Clark Turner, Brigadier General Bob Creer, Frosty, Commander Kevin Ross, Colonel Tom O'Donnell, Major Mike Buck, Colonel Lem DuBose, Lieutenant Colonel Tony Cusimano, Robert McGuire, and several others were part of that team of 2003 and 2004. The list of senior military officers is endless. Petraeus, Odierno, Dempsey, Hunziker, Helmick, and Strock were the most recognized names, but there were many others who did wonderful work without the equivalent recognition. The list of patriotic Iraqis at the oil ministry with great oil industry experience is also endless. These gentlemen worked closely with Americans. They were Iraqis motivated to improve their own country. That list includes Thamir Gadban, Dathar al-Khashab, Jabbar al-Luabi, Kefa Numan, Mohammed al-Jabouri, Nabil Lamosa, Deha al-Baka, Hazim Sultan, Dr. Radyan al-Sadi, Dr. Faleh al-Kayat, Tahir Ibrahim, Saleh Aziz, Samir Michael, Hussein al-Fatal, Abdulillah al-Amir, Natik al-Bayati, Riyad Gassab, Dr. Ahmed al-Barif Khani, Kathan al-Anbaki, Faleh al-Kawaja, Akram Akrawi, Abdul Jabbar al-Waga, and Ahmed al-Shama. These gentlemen were all patriotic Iraqis and competent oilmen that enriched my life during my first tour of 2003 and 2004. Others that became friends during my second tour included Dr. Ali Obadi, Asri Musa, Zaid Sanduk, Deya Al-Jafar, Fayyad Nima, Mutassim Hassan, Niyad Musa, and Odeh Al-Qurashi. The list of non-Iraqi professionals who worked with me between 2006 and 2011 is extensive. This list includes the great professionals at Foster Wheeler, Stanley Baker Hill, and Michael Baker Engineering. The guidance of Robert McGuire before my second tour proved priceless. He recommended that I work on a project that was needed by the Iraqis, but that was off the radar screen of the embassy. His guidance was to avoid the politics inside the embassy. I threw myself into the Southern Export Project. This led to the completion of the highly successful export project in the South, the ICOEE project. My pride in contributing to that project is probably only surpassed by the tremendous pride shared with many great Americans who participated in the surge strategy of 2007 under Generals Petraeus and Odierno. Those successes provided new life to the Iraqi people and an opportunity to better their country. The oil started to flow on April 23, 2003, and has never stopped, in spite of significant obstacles. Those obstacles were identified throughout the book and included U.S. obstacles such as political antagonism in Washington, a lack of military resources on the ground, political sensitivities to using Vice President Cheney's former company, CPA's payroll and budgeting policies, government procurement delays, optics around America's role in Iraq's oil sector, the Pentagon's Syria agendas, and others. Even the Iraqi obstacles of the insurgency, crime, and political decisions were successfully overcome to keep the oil flowing. The teamwork and partnering between the Iraqis and the coalition produced many successes. We overcame all the obstacles to keep the oil flowing. All of these positive thoughts dominated my thinking for a couple of years after returning from Iraq in 2011. Although the negatives were there on the periphery, I did my best to avoid them. My focus was on the positives and the progress of Iraq's oil sector. That changed in 2013 when Ambassador Bremer convinced me to join him and Megan O'Sullivan on a Rachel Maddow documentary. At the time, Megan was the Jean Kirkpatrick Professor of the Practice of International Affairs and the director of the Geopolitics of Energy project at Harvard University's Kennedy School. After her CPA tour in Baghdad, she was appointed as a special assistant to President George W. Bush and the Deputy National Security Advisor for Iraq and Afghanistan. Maddow's producers were putting together a documentary on the role of oil and the decision to go to war. Knowing that they would ask many questions about possible oil agendas, my preparation work addressed those issues. The result of the documentary and my research was my decision to start writing this book. Researching and writing the manuscript created many concerns about my experiences and my role. The Battle Update Assessments, BUAs, conducted by General Petraeus and his successors were previously mentioned. The surge brought hundreds of us together every morning to participate in, listen to, or watch the daily BUAs. They were every day at 0800 hours and broadcast throughout Iraq. It was easy to lose track of the day of the week in Iraq, but we always knew when it was Saturday. The Saturday BUA ended with the chaplain giving a memorial to one or a few of the fallen military heroes. The memorial normally consisted of a picture of the fallen soldier or soldiers with their name, their age, their hometown, and some other significant fact. It was a solemn part of the week. Many times the age of the fallen would be the same age as my children, mid-20s. The chaplain would talk about the soldier's family, their high school, sports, comments by fellow soldiers, and anything specific about this great American hero. It seemed like most were between 18 and 25 years of age. There were many that were older with a wife and young children at home. A few had large families with many children and even grandchildren. My heart would always become very heavy during these memorials. A gigantic lump would suddenly appear in my throat that would seem to cut off my oxygen. My nose and eyes would water as if I was fighting a severe cold. My thoughts would always shift from the fallen soldier to his family. How are they doing? How does a parent handle the death of their child? The worst fear of any parent is to have one of their children precede them in death. The parents of that 25-year-old were probably the same age as my wife and me. They were experiencing a tremendous loss, the loss of a child that they had brought into the world, experienced in those early years, then in the teenage years, and then as a young adult. They were reliving how they had helped their child transition through life, school, playing football and baseball, and participating in activities such as scouts, fishing, hunting, and religious services. How does a wife handle the death of her husband and the father of her young children? Captain Brian Freeman of Temecula, California, was one hero I will never forget. He was a 1999 West Point graduate, the father of 2 small children, and a civil affairs reserve officer that had been mobilized during the summer of 2006 and sent to Karbala, Iraq. He and his military team worked with the local Iraqis. Brian and a few of his colleagues were captured and later murdered by a group of pro-Iranian Shia insurgents in January 2007. My son-in-law did 2 military tours in Iraq. The second was in 2010. He and my daughter were so moved by the details of Captain Freeman's story that they named my oldest grandchild, Brian, after Captain Brian S. Freeman. President Dwight D. Eisenhower's quotation about war would ring in my ears as the chaplain gave his weekly memorial. Quote, "I hate war as only a soldier who has lived it can, only as one who has seen its brutality, its futility, its stupidity," unquote. The memorials always left me very sad. My emotions got the best of me. A few times my emotions turned from sadness to anger, especially during those early months of the surge when we were losing more than 100 per month. I was angry over the original decision to go to war. I would remember Ambassador Robin Raphael's comment in Baghdad during the summer of 2003, quote, "So there's no WMD, why are we here?" unquote. I would recall the New York Times columnist Thomas Friedman's quotation. Friedman was a Pulitzer Prize-winning columnist who was highly regarded by our senior general officers in Iraq. His ability to ascertain information from all sides in the Middle East disputes made his analyses much more credible than those of his peers. Haaretz is an Israeli newspaper with offices in Washington, D.C. They interviewed Friedman in his Washington office in early April 2003. The war was only a few weeks old, but Friedman understood then what it would take many of us several years to fully comprehend. Quote, It's the war the neoconservatives wanted. It's the war the neoconservatives marketed. Those people had an idea to sell when September 11th came, and they sold it. Oh boy, did they sell it. I could give you the names of 25 people if you had exiled them to a deserted island a year and a half ago, the Iraq war would not have happened, unquote. Footnoted. Friedman did not name the neoconservatives, but most were included in the hundreds of articles I have read on them since 2003. Those in government included Paul Wolfowitz, Doug Feith, Scooter Libby, John Bolton, Richard Pearl, Elliot Abrams, Ken Edelman, Raoul Gerecht, Michael Ledeen, David Wormser, David Frum, and others, footnoted. Those in the press included Bill Kristol, Robert Kagan, Judith Miller, and Lori Milroy, footnoted. One of them worked on my pre-war planning team at the Pentagon, Mike Makovsky. Mike was the youngest person on our team, single, and the only team member who refused to go to Iraq. Only a couple of low-level neoconservatives took jobs in Iraq, and they did not stay long, only 2 or 3 months. They left when things got tough. Many of my colleagues familiar with the Iraq decision agreed with Friedman. If the neoconservatives had been shipped to a deserted island in 2001, we never would have gone into Iraq. How did such a limited few sell our nation of over 300 million into fighting a war that would cost us so much? My anger would be directed at the people in the Pentagon who cheered in Doug Feith's office when Secretary Powell made his key point about weapons of mass destruction to the United Nations. Why were Feith and his colleagues so happy about going to war? My anger would be directed at Vice President Cheney for what seemed to be a simplistic approach to Middle East politics, using our military to solve every Middle East problem. My anger would be directed at President Bush for failing to require more certain information from the CIA before deciding on war. Quote, "It's a slam dunk," unquote, should have been immediately followed up with 10 or more specific questions. Footnoted. Such trivial comments without facts to back them up were irresponsible. My anger would be directed at the many congressmen and senators who gave their support to President Bush without asking those important questions that any competent lawmaker should ask before taking us to war. The common denominator of all the recipients of my anger was that not a single one of them was in Iraq with us at the time. None of their children or grandchildren was with us in Iraq at the time. None of their children or grandchildren was among the 4,489 fallen heroes of the Iraq War. What was the role of oil in the decision to go to war? Many Americans since 2002 have asked that question, and the answers have surprised me. Many would comment that it was obvious, as if there was no other reason to go to war against Iraq except for oil. Many would comment that Vice President Cheney pushed for war out of pure greed because of his former company, Halliburton. Some would comment that President Bush wanted to reward his friends in the oil patch with huge contracts in Iraq. I tended to ignore all of these comments as being politically motivated by the uninformed. I did not see anything close to that activity during my pre-war planning in my time in Iraq. Phil Carroll commented to me when he arrived in Baghdad that if he saw anything close to a quote-unquote oil grab, he would immediately depart Iraq. Phil stayed until the end of his tour in September 2003. Ambassador Bremer shared with me in 2016 that no one discussed oil before his departure to Baghdad in May 2003. It was discussed only in regard to its important role in Iraq's economy and the importance of getting the economy moving. Oil Minister Tamir Gadban responded to me in 2013 about such uninformed comments. Quote, Gary, if the Americans were interested in taking our oil, you did a horrible job. The Chinese and the Russians have most of the large contracts, unquote. Some Americans would comment that the war was about oil because Saddam could use the money from oil sales outside of the UN Oil for Food program to pursue his weapons objectives. That comment made some sense. It was obviously true, but then that supported the argument of weapons of mass destruction being the reason for war. Short of reading President Bush's mind, there is no way of determining if his reason for invading Iraq was motivated by oil. After the Maddow documentary, I took a different approach to thinking about the role of oil in the war decision. Rather than looking at accusations and dismissing them out of an obvious lack of factual evidence, I decided to look at all the oil agendas that I saw during 2002 and 2003. I researched using my notes, my emails, internet articles, and the dozen interviews that I conducted in 2015 and 2016. Most oil agendas that I found in my notes were quickly dismissed because there was no follow-up, no support for them. For example, a couple of inquiries came into Baghdad during the summer of 2003 from small oil companies and Republican supporters asking for oil contracts. Those companies were advised of the procedures that CPA and the oil ministry followed to award contracts. The individuals and companies were irritated with our response, but we never heard from them again. Supplying Iraqi oil to Israel was the one unofficial agenda item that received a lot of government sponsorship and emphasis in the press. There was much more unofficial interest in this than in any other agenda item. Oil Minister Tamir Gadban stated in a presentation at a think tank in Washington, D.C. during December 2005 that he was asked more questions about the Kirkuk to Haifa pipeline than any other oil sector issue. I did not become aware of many of the facts about this agenda until many years after 2003. I learned several specifics only during my manuscript research effort in 2015. Before 2014, I would have said that oil played little to no role in the decision to go to war. The more I learned of the facts behind the Israel oil agenda, the more I was disturbed and thought that oil played a significant role. Dr. Ahmed Chalabi tried to convince the CIA and the State Department to buy into his agenda for removing Saddam after 1991. Those agencies tried working with him but recognized that he was not trustworthy and eventually distanced themselves. Dr. Ahmed Chalabi had an unscrupulous reputation among his critics. His supporters would not defend him against this reputation. Chalabi found a more hospitable group in the powerful American conservatives with excellent contacts within the Israel lobby. These gentlemen were all very intelligent and all had experience in previous Republican administrations and in the Middle East. Chalabi failed with the CIA and state, but he had no problem convincing this group to support him. They were what I have previously called the neoconservatives or neocons. Footnoted. Why was it so easy for him to deceive the neocons into supporting his Iraq war agenda? What was he selling to them that he did not sell to the CIA and state? Was greed part of the equation? Milton Friedman had a theory that, quote, societies run on greed, unquote. Let's try to find the possible greed involved in this oil agenda. Let's follow the money. Let me lay out the facts that have contributed to my hauntings. These facts are grouped in two categories, those that I knew in 2003 and those facts I learned later. Known by me during the summer of 2003. Point. Senior political appointees at the Pentagon push for Dr. Ahmed Chalabi to be prime minister. Point. The only deliberate infrastructure target during military operations was the K3 pump station that pumped oil to Syria. Point. Mike Makovsky at the Pentagon contacted me during the summer of 2003 trying to get a status on the Haifa pipeline. Learned by me after 2004. Point. Mike Makovsky had possible linkages to the Israeli Foreign Service. Point. During the late 1990s, Dr. Ahmed Chalabi promised the Israel lobby that he would provide Iraqi oil to Israel over the Haifa pipeline if the lobby would support him as the first prime minister after Saddam. Point. The Israeli infrastructure minister Joseph Paritsky publicly announced on March 31, 2003, his intention to reopen the Kirkuk to Haifa pipeline and receive Iraqi oil before the end of 2003. Point. The Israeli finance minister Benjamin Netanyahu hyped investors in London in June 2003 so they would provide capital for rebuilding the Haifa pipeline. Point. Secure crypto communications were installed between Chalabi's offices in Baghdad and the office of the vice president, where Scooter Libby was chief of staff. Point. Scooter Libby made a small fortune as Mark Rich's lawyer over a 16-year period during the 1980s and 1990s. Mark Rich was known as the quote-unquote king of oil because of his lucrative Middle East oil trading business, specifically the billions of dollars he made from a secret pipeline through Israel. Point. A former CIA official stated that it had long been a dream of a powerful section of the people driving the administration of President George W. Bush and the war in Iraq to safeguard Israel's access to oil. Taken individually, each of these facts was circumstantial and did not support an agenda case. However, when the dots were connected, the case became more than probable. It took me more than 12 years to realize why the people in Doug Feith's office were cheering so loud when the Secretary Powell so convincingly stated the casus belli before the United Nations. A discussion of each of these bullet points is appropriate. Let's take them in the order listed. Okay, before we start this, quickly break here to point out that this is Jeremy Rothkushel and Greg McCarran of the Antedote Deepcore text, reading from Iraq and the Politics of Oil, an Insider's Perspective by Gary Vogler. And we are in chapter 20, titled What Haunts Me, on page 261. Quote, a discussion of each of these bullet points is appropriate. Let's take them in the order listed. Senior political appointees at the Pentagon push for Dr. Ahmed Chalabi to be prime minister. Secretary Rumsfeld may not have officially supported Chalabi for Iraq's first post-Saddam prime minister position, but there was no doubt that his subordinates were officially and unofficially supporting Chalabi. As I stated in an earlier chapter, my Kuwait roommate was a retired Navy SEAL, Terry Sullivan. He and Dr. Harold Rode were sent to Kuwait by Doug Feith to link up with Chalabi's people. Greg, aside, by the way, Dr. Harold Rode, I think he was part of the Clean Break writing team.
I believe so. He was, Harold Rode is connected with this crew that we have identified here. You know what? Yeah, he is connected. I can't think off the top of my head exactly what his connection is, but at an extended level, he's definitely connected with this crew of neocons that's been identified here.
Okay, yeah. Okay, page 261, Iraq and the Politics of Oil, on Insider's Perspective by Gary Vogler. Quote, he and Dr. Harold Rode were sent to Kuwait by Doug Feith to link up with Chalabi's people. Mike McCall... What?
By the way, I'm reading here. As Harold Rode was connected, directly met with the aforementioned Larry Franklin in Rome with Manuchar Gorbanifar as it figures into the AIPAC scandal around Iran. So Harold Rode, I don't have the particular specifics on the Clean Break and the Worms or Feith crew in front right now, but he's definitely connected with this bigger network of hawks that we have been identifying here. So
That's like the Ladine inner circle too.
yes, yes,
That
yes.
connection via Bonifar, and I mean that's at the
Yeah, that
epicenter
would
of
have been
Iran Contra.
Ladine's involvement in Rome with these meetings where this that we're at the center of the Franklin scandal involving the turning over of U.S. documents on Iran policy to basically to Israeli intelligence, and that once again what we're talking about, figuring in with the bigger, what I mentioned earlier, with like this overall agenda to control these particular areas of policy by this small, powerful network of individuals and interests in this period here.
I believe that Rode was not an author on Clean Break.
No, but he's connected. He's involved in these. He's definitely
Oh yeah, he's in the circle.
in these circles big time. Yes.
Okay, so back to page 261 of Iraq and the Politics of Oil: An Insider's Perspective by Gary Vogler. Quote, Mike Makovsky informed the EIPG team during pre-war planning that Chalabi would be Iraq's first post-Saddam prime minister. Retired Lieutenant General Jay Garner was the first civilian head of Iraq. Jay advised me in 2016 that Doug Feith met with him just before his departure for Kuwait. Feith suggested that Garner turn Iraq over to Chalabi shortly after Baghdad fell. Feith became livid in a telephone conversation with Garner a few days later after Jay answered questions at a press conference before departing the Pentagon for Kuwait. His answer to a question that made Feith so angry. Jay said that he and the U.S. government had not chosen Chalabi or any other specific Iraqi to lead Iraq after the fall of Saddam. Footnoted. It did not take long for Chalabi to walk away from his promise to the neocons of opening a pipeline to Haifa. Anyone with an understanding of Iraqi society would know that Chalabi could not deliver on this guarantee, but the neocons had a strong motivation to believe his pre-war promises. His duping of the neocons became public information in 2004. An article in Salon.com from 2004, quote, How Ahmed Chalabi calmed the neocons, unquote, identifies the details of how he deceived them. It includes a quotation from Doug Feith's former law partner at Feith and Zell, PC, who was trying to develop his Israeli law practice with Chalabi's promises. Mark Zell continued to be a partner in the firm that Feith left in 2001 to take the Pentagon job. Quote, he said he would end Iraq's boycott of trade with Israel and would allow Israeli companies to do business there. He said the new Iraqi government would agree to rebuild the pipeline from Mosul in the northern Iraqi oil fields to Haifa. But Chalabi has delivered on none of them, unquote. L. Mark Zell went on to say, quote, Ahmed Chalabi is a treacherous, spineless turncoat, unquote. The neocons were too hard on their Iraqi partner. He did the only thing he could do in 2003 to secretly provide oil to Israel. As I stated earlier in the book, Chalabi was successful at selling Iraqi oil to the oil trading company that had supplied most of Israel's oil since 1973, Glencore. Footnoted. The SOMO Director General in mid-2003, Mohammed al-Jabouri, only sold oil to end users' refineries. He refused to sell to oil traders during CPA. Chalabi ordered al-Jabouri to sell Iraqi oil to Glencore, and al-Jabouri refused. In October 2003, Chalabi instructed Oil Minister Ibrahim Bar al-Ulum to replace the SOMO Director General with an Iraqi that would sell oil to Glencore. Footnoted. Al-Jabouri was removed. The only deliberate oil infrastructure target during military operations was the K3 pump station that pumped oil to Syria. The U.S. military hit the K3 pump station in Anbar province during the invasion. That pump station was pumping crude oil to ports in Syria prior to the invasion. While K3 was still burning from the attack, Secretary Rumsfeld stated to the press that the pump station was destroyed in order to penalize Syria for enabling Saddam to bypass sanctions prior to the invasion. Footnoted. Such an explanation made no sense. It was not logical. Syria's future benefit under a U.S. occupation or new Iraqi government would only be the tolls received from those exports. Those tolls represented less than 5% of the value of the crude exported. The other 95% of that value was for Iraq. The destruction of Iraq's K3 pump station hurt Iraq much more than Syria. Was there a more credible explanation for destroying the pump station? An action memo from Feith to Rumsfeld on January 16, 2003, specifically directed the military to, quote, keep the pipeline open only if Syria cooperates on issues of interest to U.S. coalition, unquote, footnoted. The memo was declassified in 2015. Paul Wolfowitz verbally reversed those written orders a month after issuance, and after Secretary Powell made his WMD presentation to the United Nations. Wolfowitz gave his direction to General Franks during a video teleconference that took place a couple of weeks before the Iraqi invasion. I was present in the meeting. The following quotation in the London press shortly after the K3 destruction identified the motivation. Quote, it's the Haifa pipeline's resurrection. I'll read again. Quote, it's the Haifa pipeline's resurrection. Oh, I see. The Haifa pipeline's resurrection would transform economic power in the region, bringing revenue to the new U.S.-dominated Iraq, cutting out Syria, and solving Israel's energy crisis at a stroke, unquote. Our mission was to restore the oil sector to pre-war levels, but Phil Carroll was ordered by the Pentagon not to reconstruct the destroyed K3 pump station. A credible and logical explanation for the destruction of K3 was to remove any competition to future Haifa pipeline expansions. Mike Bukovsky contacted me from the Pentagon during the summer of 2003 to get a status on the Haifa pipeline. My first exposure to the existence of the old Haifa pipeline was when Bukovsky phoned from the Pentagon to inquire about its status. He labeled this inquiry to me as a top priority project from the civilian leadership at the Pentagon. He hung up the phone on me when I realized his inquiry was about a very sensitive pipeline to Israel and requested that he submit his request in writing. This incident was covered in detail in an earlier chapter. In Steve Call's book, Private Empire, Mike claimed that he was responding to an Israeli inquiry about the pipeline. Footnoted. Mike Bukovsky had links to the Israeli government. It was revealed in 2005 that Bukovsky had left the United States for Israel in 1989 to join the Israeli Foreign Service. Footnoted. In December 2005, I asked Mike about the reports of his time in the Israel Defense Forces, IDF, and his response was that he could neither confirm nor deny these allegations. Phil Carroll advised me in 2005 that Bukovsky received his top secret security clearance only after Doug Feith trumped the challenges of the Pentagon Security Group. Mike Mobbs said that Bukovsky was hired at the Pentagon in 2002 because of his AIPAC contacts. Footnoted. AIPAC was involved in an espionage scandal in Doug Feith's group in 2005. Footnoted. This raised my suspicions that Bukovsky was possibly some type of an agent for the Israeli government. It also raised my suspicions about why an Israeli agent with little to no oil and gas experience was assigned as the Pentagon's Iraq oil contact. During the 1990s, Dr. Ahmed Chalabi promised the Israel lobby that he would provide Iraqi oil to Israel over the Haifa pipeline if the lobby would support him as the first prime minister after Saddam. Chalabi made a rousing speech to the Jewish Institute for National Security Affairs, JINSA, in June 1997. JINSA is a right-wing pro-Israel advocacy group, part of the powerful Israel lobby. During that speech, Chalabi proposed expanding economic ties between Iraq and Israel by restoring the Kirkuk to Haifa pipeline. Footnoted. 10 years after the Iraq invasion, Mike Bukovsky was appointed CEO of JINSA. Footnoted. The Israeli infrastructure minister Joseph Paritsky publicly announced on March 31, 2003, his intention to reopen the Kirkuk to Haifa pipeline and receive Iraqi oil before the end of 2003. While the coalition forces were still fighting their way to Baghdad, Minister Paritsky was making public announcements about how Israel would economically benefit from the U.S. war. The Israeli news service Haaretz quotes Paritsky on March 31st, 2003, as saying that the reopened Kirkuk to Haifa pipeline would cut Israel's energy bill drastically by more than 25%. In 2003, Israel was very dependent on imported oil to meet its energy needs. Israel was getting most of its oil from Russia at the time, and Paritsky felt that Israel was paying a premium for that oil. Footnoted. Paritsky was quoted in Haaretz later in the summer of 2003 as working closely with sources inside the Pentagon. A telegram from the Pentagon in August to the Israeli government requested that Israel check the possibility of pumping oil from Iraq to Haifa. Footnoted. The Israeli finance minister hyped investors in London in June 2003 so that they would provide capital for rebuilding the Haifa pipeline. Paritsky was not the only member of Israel's cabinet in 2003 publicly making statements about getting Iraqi oil. The Israeli finance minister in 2003 was Benjamin Netanyahu. He was in London in June 2003 promoting the Haifa pipeline to potential investors. Quote, It won't be long when you will see Iraqi oil flowing to Haifa. It is not a pipe dream, unquote, Netanyahu told the investor group. A side note, what a schmuck, dude. Okay, back to the text. We're on page 264. We're in chapter 20 of Iraq and the Politics of Oil in Insider's Perspective, Gary Vogler. And you can definitely, you can hear in your mind's eye Netanyahu cheesing out. It won't be long when you will see Iraqi oil flowing to Haifa. It is not a pipe dream, he told the investor group. Oh my gosh, dude. It's interesting. This is a lot. What's part of the reason for reading this chapter is it sort of sums up a lot of what he found out, but it also points out what he knew then and then what he knows now. And I would say a lot of this points to the crucial importance of open source intelligence and analysis. Because of course, if Vogler could have figured this out, there was probably enough inklings on the record, open source, that if he'd been a little bit more open to the ideas of open source intelligence analysis, he would have realized this. But combining this now, his backward look at this is totally damning. All right. Page 264 of Iraq and the Politics of Oil, an Insider's Perspective by Gary Vogler.
It is damning, and it also, it continues to, it's, a lot of people just look at it like, well, this is the past, and it's filling in important dots about the past, but it, it's all of this, the post-September 11th world, and it all remains so relevant and important to this day, to this moment, understanding the, everything's happened with regards to U.S., the effects and ramifications it's had on the region, on the just what happened with the you see a lot of the same players will pop up in the Trump drama in terms of installing Trump. There's still connections, there's still extended aspects of this. It all still interconnects to this day, and it's all still very relevant to today. And Vogler, it took him a number of years to connect the dots, but I'm very appreciative and grateful that he was able to put this information together and document it and put it out on the record. I'll just say this, this chapter is this chapter of this book, I don't know if I can think of a lot of other chapters in volumes of documents that come from somebody who was in the experiences that he had and the capacity that he had. This is important information that, that should be, that people should know about it, but it's so suppressed. And but it continues to affect so many aspects of our world and our politics, geopolitics to this day. And it's as just as everything since September 11th stuff, including the events of 9/11 itself. It's still, I say, it becomes equally, if not more important to understand as time goes on. So.
More and more important, especially with the questions of Afghanistan on the table, the pullout September 11th, on September 11th this year. And that we still don't, I still have never really heard serious public talk that brings all of this history together about how Iraq went down. and why. And there's still more to figure out here in terms of like what exact, the totality of the interests here, because it is incredible that Vogler actually had this journey, went through this journey. And not only, he could have just gone through knowing it and kept it to the sort of, the normal, insider military gossip network where they don't say anything ever publicly. But instead, he published with a university press, a highly fact based. He became a journalist, really, did tons of interviews. He did cross checking facts and expanding on his direct sourcing and his interviews of people after the fact with open source intelligence and public reporting after the fact. And he, it's incredible that we have this out in the public rather than, a bunch of isolated FOIA documents and some bits of press reports. No, he gives the run. He says what's happening. And what's interesting about this is this shows the revelation of an individual who is caught up in an insertion of an apparent intelligence operation that included the highest elements of a foreign government. And so then we begin to, there's a direct line then to then unpack Afghanistan, 9/11, and all of these things in a highly credible fashion in relationship to this whole network. Because as we'll see too, the parallel side of this in terms of the geopolitics and those interests is the deep espionage networks and the Maxwell Epstein network that is apparently, still in the works with Maxwell's is facing trial. But meanwhile, Blinken is the Secretary of State, tied in via, married into the family related directly to Maxwell's lawyer, So we're still dealing with this network, but it's the other side of it. And so we want to help bring these sides of it together to understand the whole scenario.
Yeah, and one more point is that it's not mentioned in here at all, but you would have to think that that if you dug and you took a look, that there would be some interconnecting with something that's discussed quite a bit, I'd say, within like quote unquote alternative media circles, which of course is genie energy, which is very much involved in American policy in Syria. And I was just thinking real quick about number one, the connection of the former Southwest director of APAC, who went on to be the
Exactly.
Michael Glassner, head of one of the heads of Trump's campaign 2016, and then again his reelection campaign 2020, as well as the Epstein connected former governor of New Mexico and former energy secretary under Clinton, Bill Richardson. So I just imagine if you do a little digging, you'd find some more connections and more of an extension of this through an operation like that. So.
Rupert Murdoch, right? Rothschild,
and
Dick
Cheney as well. Yes.
Yeah. Right. And that's so interesting. Like that's a key factor in understanding some of the energy interests around Israel, Syria, is genie energy, of course. And you're right. You're so right about to point out this background of Glassner, via Southwest APAC, but then also he then directly ties into the administrative proceedings preceding the September 11th attack on Lower Manhattan Ground Zero via he was the the chief of staff, right, for Eisenberg, while at the Port Authority in relationship to the Lauder instigated, directed, quote unquote, privatization of the Port Authority to put the World Trade Center fully into the hands of Larry Silverstein weeks before September 11th. And of course, Larry Silverstein, from the article, what was it? Something about ashes, something about memory of ashes, something like that, reported that Silverstein spoke with Netanyahu every single Sunday for years, up through September 11th. Right. So there is the direct network connections.
Haaretz. The article is from Haaretz, dated November 21st, 2001. Up in Smoke was the title of the
Up in Smoke.
Yeah. And of course, Glassner, we talked about him before, but once again, something else we'll probably revisit in the future. A veteran of the Bob Dole networks, anyway.
Wow. Okay. All right. Page 264 of Iraq and the Politics of Oil, an Insider's Perspective by Gary Vogler. This is Jeremy Roth-Kushel and Greg McCarran of the Antedote. We're doing Deepcore text, and we are finishing up segments of this book with chapter 20 titled What Haunts Me. We're on page 264. Benjamin Netanyahu has just told potential investors, quote, "It won't be long when you will see Iraqi oil flowing to Haifa. It is not a pipe dream," unquote, Netanyahu told the investor group, footnoted. Secure crypto communications were installed between Ahmed Chalabi's offices in Baghdad and the office of the vice president, where Scooter Libby was chief of staff. An STU-3 looks like an old telephone from the 1980s. However, it is a highly technical phone that enables encrypted secure voice transmission. One was installed in Chalabi's Iraqi National Congress, INC headquarters, for communications to the vice president's offices in D.C. An army colonel was sent to support Chalabi with the secure communication. Unfortunately, that colonel had to be evacuated from Iraq on emergency leave. Rather than sending a new officer to support this effort, CENTCOM sent a colonel to retrieve the STU-3. The Chalabi headquarters did not want to give up the instrument. It took several weeks to retrieve it. This communication link was a secure line back to the office of the vice president in Washington, D.C. Scooter Libby was the vice president's chief of staff. And by the way, was he the one of the first or the first pardon of the anti-neocon guy, Trump?
I'm not sure if he was the first major pardon, but he was definitely one of the pardons. I mean, between Scooter Libby and Bernard Kerik, you could see a lot about the nature, the types of pardons. And while Trump didn't directly pardon Jonathan Pollard, I mean, it was Trump administration that enabled Pollard to travel back to Israel and be greeted by Netanyahu as he got off his plane. So,
oh my gosh, dude! He also pardoned Hillel Namad, who is named in a sub piece of the article mapping 9/11 Fort Lee by Gordon Duff, that basically points out that some of these networks that were arrested in relationship to the Russian, Ukrainian, Israeli mobsters in relationship to Trump Tower in 2013 in New York City were on the. It's asserted that they played some kind of role in the September 11th attacks in relationship to communications and different kinds of covert actions in the Lower Manhattan context. So it ended up pretty from 9/11 to 11/9 being not only descriptive looking backwards, but it was actually sort of hypothetically correct looking forward about what these networks were that Trump was apparently serving, I'd say. All right, back to the book Iraq and the Politics of Oil, an Insider's Perspective by Gary Vogler, Chapter 20, What Haunts Me. Page 264, the bottom. Quote, Scooter Libby was the vice president's chief of staff. Scooter Libby made a small fortune as the lawyer of Mark Rich back in the 1980s and 1990s. Footnoted. Mark Rich was well-known within the oil trading businesses as one of the most successful within the oil trading business as one of the most successful Middle East oil traders. He made billions of dollars over a 20-year period from a secret pipeline through Israel. That pipeline transported Iranian oil through Israel to the Mediterranean. Rich transported Iranian oil while Iran held American hostages and during the following years when Iran was under U.S. sanctions. Such transactions after the Iranian Revolution would have been illegal for a U.S. company, but his company was registered in Switzerland. Footnoted. Rich was raised in New York City and joined the commodities trading group Phillips Brothers. He eventually moved to Europe with Phillips, but parted ways over a disagreement about the size of his bonus. He started his own company, Mark Rich and Company, AG, in Switzerland. This company would become Glencore International, a well-known oil trading group. His specialty was trading oil with countries under U.S. sanctions. His biggest customers included Iran and South Africa during sanctions periods. Others included Cuba, Marxist Angola, Sandinistas, Romania, and others under U.S. sanctions. Footnoted. The Internal Revenue Service investigated Rich's multi-billion-dollar business during the 1980s for evading over $100 million in back taxes. More specifically, the U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of New York, Rudolph W. Giuliani, prosecuted the case against Rich. Mark Rich did not return to the United States for his court appearance, and the FBI listed him as one of its top international fugitives. The title of the Interpol arrest warrant in 1985 was, quote, "Wanted International Criminal," unquote, and the charges included income tax evasion, racketeering, and trading with the enemy. Footnoted. Rich became well known in U.S. political circles. President Clinton signed a pardon for Rich and his partner, Pincus Green, late on January 19, 2001. Clinton's last day in office, a controversial end-of-term pardon. William Safire, a Pulitzer Prize-winning columnist for the New York Times, called the pardon, quote, "the most flagrant abuse of the presidential pardon in U.S. history," unquote. Footnoted. Scooter Libby testified before Congress on behalf of Mark Rich. Footnoted. To better understand why Mark Rich was a key figure with the Haifa pipeline agenda, it is important to understand not only his relationship to Libby, but also his oil trading history with Israel. Rich had a close relationship with several Israeli prime ministers. His company, Glencore, was an important supplier of oil to Israel for decades. Mark Rich was close to the intelligence arm of Israel, the Mossad. The Mossad referred to people like Rich as, quote-unquote, scion, the Hebrew word for helper. Footnoted. Quote, Libby was also close to the Israeli government. The former British Foreign Secretary from 2001 to 2006, Jack Straw, said of Libby, quote, "It's a toss-up whether he is working for the Israelis or the Americans on any given day," unquote. Footnoted. There was a secret Israeli pipeline between the Red Sea and the Mediterranean. The pipeline starts at the Israeli port of Eilat, adjacent to the Jordanian port of Aqaba. It is 160 miles long and 42 inches in diameter and ends at the Israeli port of Ashkelon. This pipeline through Israel carried a sizable amount of Iranian crude oil and accounted for most of the wealth that Mark Rich accumulated. It flowed before and after the United States imposed sanctions on Iran. Rich and his lawyers kept the transactions confidential so that no one knew Iranian crude oil was being delivered to Israel. It was a win-win deal for everyone involved. The Iranians had a customer for their oil. The Israelis received access to inexpensive Iranian crude oil for their refineries. And Mark Rich made billions of dollars. Israel received 60 to 90% of its oil needs from Iran between 1973 and 1994. Footnoted. An article in The Guardian in April 2003 spoke of the history of key people in the Bush administration and their dream of getting Iraqi oil for Israel. It quoted a former senior CIA official, quote, "It has long been a dream of a powerful section of the people now driving this administration of President George W. Bush and the war in Iraq to safeguard Israel's energy supply as well as that of the United States," unquote. Footnoted. An effort was made by the U.S. government in 1983 to move Iraqi crude oil to the port of Aqaba, adjacent to the southern end of the Israeli pipeline. Such volumes could have replaced Iranian crude oil on the secret Israeli pipeline. Donald Rumsfeld was CEO of O.D. Searle and Company in the early 1980s. Rumsfeld was appointed as a presidential envoy by President Reagan to visit many Middle East countries. He visited Saddam in Baghdad in December 1983 and in March 1984. The Iran-Iraq war had taken a toll on Saddam's ability to export his oil. Iran had shut down Iraq's oil exports through the Basra ports. Syria was Iran's ally at the time. They shut down Iraq's export pipeline through Syria. Saddam was totally dependent on exports through Turkey to the Mediterranean. One of Rumsfeld's agenda items was to help Saddam transport Iraq's crude through a different route. Rumsfeld proposed an export pipeline through Jordan to Aqaba. The ports of Aqaba and Eilat are adjacent to each other at the northeast end of the Gulf of Aqaba. Such a pipeline would have enabled Israel to access Iraqi crude oil for its secret pipeline rather than Iranian crude oil, which is under U.S. sanctions, footnoted. An initiative to send a private citizen as a presidential envoy to the Middle East would have required significant coordination through the State Department. Paul Wolfowitz was the director of policy planning at DOS in 1981 and 1982. He was moved to Assistant Secretary of State for East Asian and Pacific Affairs in 1983. Wolfowitz brought Scooter Libby into DOS to work for him during this period. Paul Wolfowitz had been Scooter Libby's mentor since teaching Libby at Yale in the 1970s. Footnoted. Then there's a map on top of page 267 of Iraq and the Politics of Oil, an Insider's Perspective by Gary Vogler. There's a map of the proposed export pipelines to Jordan, Israel, as of 2003. It shows the different pipelines, and the Kirkuk to Haifa pipeline having been closed in 1948. Okay. Quote, billions of U.S. dollars were at stake for a Haifa pipeline. The suggested pipeline size would have transported $30 to $50 billion per year of Iraqi oil through Israel. Was it possible that the neocons were motivated by the opportunity for financial gain with an Iraqi pipeline to Haifa? Would a pipeline to Aqaba have been a fallback position if rebuilding the Haifa pipeline in 2003 were not acceptable to Iraq? Would many of Friedman's 25 neoconservatives get access to the economic gains from a pipeline to Haifa or Aqaba? I think it is naive to believe that greed did not play a role in their motivation to push the Iraq War. Dr. Ahmed Chalabi made pre-war promises about opening trade between Iraq and Israel. He promised to open a pipeline to Haifa for exporting millions of barrels per day of crude oil. How could the highly educated and brilliant neocons have fallen so easily for the lies of a known and unscrupulous opportunist like Dr. Ahmed Chalabi? How were they so easily blinded to what was obvious to the CIA and state? Does greed explain this blindness? The costs to the United States for invading Iraq were huge. There were 4,489 sons and daughters killed, 32,223 troops injured, not including PTSD, at least 134,000 Iraqi civilians killed, 150 reporters killed, 2.8 million people who either remain internally displaced or have fled Iraq, and a financial cost of more than $2 trillion. Footnoted. Did my country incur all of these costs because of a couple dozen neocons? Did a network of highly educated right-wing pro-Israel U.S. government senior political appointees develop a plan to enrich themselves and their colleagues? Did they bring in staffers with a similar ideology to help execute such a plan? Some staffers like Mike Makovsky arrived in 2002 with direct ties to the Israeli government. Furthermore, this group of neocons is still giving speeches, promoting the next Middle East war, lecturing at universities, appearing as guests on television political shows, and receiving honorariums. They feel no shame, no remorse. They never attended a Saturday BUA or listened to the chaplain attempt to explain the loss of a young soldier. They missed that completely. What haunts me is that I may have been misled into believing that WMD were the noble reason for war when it was just an excuse for their war. Was I an unknowing participant in an oil scheme? What troubles me are the grieving parents or spouse or children of that soldier who made the ultimate sacrifice, or the caregiver of that disabled soldier who could no longer care for himself or herself. It is essential that the survivors understand the noble cause of the military profession. It is a principled cause of duty to country and a love of country. There is something about raising your right hand and swearing to defend the Constitution of our country against our enemies. This is a noble cause. It is a cause that brings patriotic Americans together on a military team. Being part of a military team engaged in battle is an event that few experience. The brotherhood of those team members is extremely close. Studies have shown that soldiers are not motivated during battle because of their president or congressman or other political leaders. No, soldiers fight for one another. It is the honor of their profession to die for their fellow soldiers. It is a creed among brothers and sisters. It is their creed of duty, honor, and country. America must be vigilant in the future. We cannot allow another group, such as the neocons, to push our country into a costly and unnecessary Middle East war, as they did in Iraq. And that's the end of chapter 20. What haunts me in the book Iraq and the Politics of Oil, an Insider's Perspective by Gary Vogler. And there's an epilogue that has some additional information after the fact about some more specifics on the oil, where the oil sector ended up. But we'll leave it there, and we will. I'll just say, and then I'll pass it over to you, Greg, that it's obvious that this was a big undertaking in many ways, and I'd say unfinished. Really, it seems totally undigested there at the end. That's sort of like his final point, his final moral point, and he tries to reburnish his faith in the noble honor of the military commitment and the oath. And yet it's interesting. He also leaves out the against our enemies. He does not quote that it's against all enemies, foreign and domestic, and what it means then to defend the Constitution against the enemies of it in a domestic fashion. And he also, obviously misses pieces. This is some of the bigger geopolitical pieces, that this was beyond just the greed of, a small group of individuals. There was big geopolitical plans here too, even in addition to the schemes around Israeli oil concerns. And of course, that's why basically this is a trilogy that we're doing in terms of Antedote Deepcore texts surrounding understanding of the initiation of the 2003 invasion of the war in Iraq, which we began to take on this year soon after its 18th anniversary on March 20th of 2021. And so next up will be we've covered the chapter 8 of the Israel Lobby by Mearsheimer and Walt, specifically about the nature of the domestic political agenda carried out by the totality, really, of the organized Israel Lobby, which is multiple individuals, multiple institutions, and then how that directly tied in specifically with neoconservative interests and aspects of the government of Israel. Now we've completed a few sections of Iraq and the Politics of Oil, an Insider's Perspective by Gary Vogler, a couple chapters, chapter 2 and chapter 20, about the war for Iraq, the war for oil for Israel component to it, which fills in some key pieces here. And this is really a yeoman's, no matter the missing pieces or the things we may disagree with in terms of his American soldier-centric perspective, which is understandable from him being a veteran American soldier, and that he was working for the American government at the time, that's where his loyalties lie. But, or the missing pieces here, just the fact of that this is now in hardcover book form, sourced out by a university press here in Lawrence, Kansas, rather than just some rumor monger, the Pentagon, the perfumed Pentagon generals gossiping. No, the public has the access to this. Now we need to talk about it and what it means. And so the final piece in this trilogy of understanding the larger parameters and background and intent and conspiracy to commit international war crimes, really, in terms of Iraq, will be the clean break document written by a small group of hardline neoconservatives for then incoming Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, which is very interesting that he plays a role in the Iraq war for oil for Israel analysis, being that he was the finance minister hyping up this oil possibility in London in the summer of 2003 as the Israeli finance minister. Was that yeah, finance minister.
Yes, yes.
So, all right. So, any final considerations or things we should you want to discuss, Greg?
Well, I definitely second your assessment. This chapter, I mean, this is I mean, in terms of the vital importance of this chapter, even outside of the things like where he's not, where we wouldn't necessarily be more or less inclined to completely agree or share the ideology of. I mean, that aside, and you're not going to find anybody who will have like a stance on perspectives, but from his perspective, as like you can see that this is actually somebody who actually appears to be an actual American patriot who was part of something that he, it seems to me, didn't really understand at the time. But as far as I guess maybe Paul Bremer should be indirectly thanked for getting Vogler to look back into this, because I mean it was Paul Bremer who I guess urged him to take part in this Madhouse series, and so as a result of this, Vogler reopens that history and he finds out a lot of information that leads him to understand that like this cause that he was involved in these in the right at the center of the heart of this aspect of the Iraq War operation. He was able to go back and reassess things, find out some things, make some revelations, perhaps with the benefit of hindsight, that and admit, look, this. But that last chapter, I mean, is so powerful in terms of Vogler, maybe even indirectly, maybe even accidentally, like really combination of connecting a lot of dots for people like us, but then also like really, I think he gets to the heart of and it's also important to see, notice, like it's not being done in a way that's like, that's conveying like, oh, like any type, or even like focusing and zeroing in on any type of, racial or cultural or religious dynamics. And it's very straightforward. I think he really identifies and gets at the heart of the network of operatives, in terms of even bringing in the Thomas Friedman quote. And I think it's done in a fairly, I think he really lays bare this network in a very, I would say, one of the more responsible and straightforward and responsible, which I think is important. It's done in a, I would say, a pretty responsible way. And I think he's, whether he realizes or not, like the depths of, like, I think a combination of filling out important details, but I think he has a grasp and understanding of where the heart of this propaganda operation, which led to this war. And it's important once again to point out, it shows you that it's not like particularly even like Israel per se, or American, even Zionists of Jewish descent per se, but it's a particular network of operatives. It is really, it's that 25, the group of 25 people, maybe a few others in high positions that were right at the center of in the heart of this. And I think Vogler, I appreciate that he comes at it and he lays out the facts of goes into a lot of details regarding the history of the intrigue of oil, going back to the role of some of these neoconservatives in the Reagan administration taking advantage of the Iraq-Iran war, and then leading up from there, bringing in the central role of Mark Rich, who should probably once again be reevaluated by us at some point in the future. And I think this is a chapter that, like, much like we talk about, Craig Unger and people like that. I mean, this should be on every, like, if we had a serious media, serious institutions, like this would be on, there'd be primetime interviews and documentaries devoted to this. And I mean, this is, I would say this might be one of the most important chapters written in recent publishing history regarding this vital importance of the scope of the information contained in it. So yeah, I definitely commend Vogler for, once, as you said, like taking this out of like just gossip mills and hearsay, and actually documenting it and putting it on the record based on combination of his personal experiences and then research that he did, and interviews he did, as you said, actually taking up journalism for somebody who's not definitely was not a journalist by trade, and going out and taking the time and doing the interviews and getting the research and finding out this history and connecting it to what he personally experienced. I mean, it's extremely commendable. And I definitely applaud Vogler for putting this out there. And it should be more well known. But I mean, at the very least, people like us can take this and at least like start our own conversations on this and get the word out to in whatever fashion we can in terms of platforms such as this. So definitely, I thank Gary Vogler, for doing this, and this is extremely, to say it's valuable and would be such an understatement. But my hat's off to him, and I definitely am appreciative that he did this undertaking. It's so it's of vital importance that people know this information, and that at least it's out there and that conversations can be had on it. So
Yes, yeah, because even beyond just the question of like him concretizing all these revelations out of gossip, it's the fact that he went public, and that's the difference between actually being a patriot and I would say being courageous, or just being a perfume prince of the Pentagon and sharing gossiping little secrets with each other like little bitches, sharing some little cute little thing that they've come up with, or what you guys know about, and never inform the public. This is the work of a patriot, sort of going out and not only dealing with the difficulty of having a realization and then documenting it, but then also then publishing it and bringing it out to the public. And you will note that if it doesn't look like there was any Maddow follow up, to do a newer documentary about the origins of the Iraq War with Vogler after this book comes out. And I would also just, final thing I would say is that it's interesting too that the flip side of it is it makes you consider other possibilities in relationship to with all these other narratives that have been driven into our minds across the board, but most intensely by certain aspects of the critical left and progressive press and all of that, of things around the oil companies and Bush and the oil companies and the military contractors and Cheney and Halliburton. And there's obviously, there's little, something there, but this really recalibrates a lot of that. I would say, especially in relationship to the potential intent, or at the very least, the actuality of what those progressive press people, so-called peace people, were actually doing by not covering this other dynamic, this Israeli connection across the board, whether from clean break or to this oil for Israel scenario, and how it begins to become so glaring, the focus on the simplistic nature of the war for oil, or the war for the military contractors, or Halliburton, and sort of, how there's so many progressive films and writings and all of that kind of stuff, and barely a word mentioned about this. Basically, the Israel lobby comes out 2006, the article, the book 2007, and it's really a lot of like the progressive and liberal Zionists and sort of PC kind of people who are actually attacking it, such as someone like Noam Chomsky, for example, actually, who would basically say, just tell the Chamber of Commerce that this is against American interests,
yeah,
and that this is the work of, what, Greg, you saying, small ethnic lobby.
to be the work of a small ethnic lobby.
What a punk, dude. When he was at UCLA in 2010 or 11, and he's something about this was like he was talking in this realm, and I interjected about how the war on terror is racist. It has some ethnic dimensions to certain aspects of the targeting and all of that. And but more so beyond Chomsky, I sort of think of all of the films made about oil and Bush, and I mean even like even on to like Michael Moore and Fahrenheit 9/11 and Bin Laden and Bush and all of that. And meanwhile, there's Ari Emanuel in the background there, which then you bring in Trump and all of that we discussed from 9/11 to 11/9, and you really begin to see a major cover up for a very specific network not for an entirety of a foreign country, not for the entirety of even the U.S. domestic supporters of that country, not the entirety of an ethnic group or religion, but a specific and fairly small group of political operatives in service of higher level geopolitical and global power dynamics who made this happen. They can be named. The facts of the matter are obviously coming out more and more in terms of just this book. This is a fairly recent book. This is almost 15 years after the launching of the Iraq War when this came out in 2017. And this supplies a key piece of it: names and dates, all verifiable. I would say all verified. I mean, he was there. No one's disputing that he was there. He saw this thing. Makovsky, Jinsa, Zell, Mark Rich, Chalabi, Libby, Cheney, Fife, the whole network, so there it is. And so we'll continue onwards and then dig into the bigger geopolitical agenda in terms of beyond oil, but in terms of destabilization. And specifically what's great about this book too is it begins to help turn the corner in relationship to understanding Iraq, the war in Iraq, in relationship to the destabilization effort and what's going on in relationship to Syria, and how they are different, how they were they were actually strategized and projected to be different in relationship specifically to the white paper of the clean break. And this is also something that's been totally covered up by similar progressive sphere, next generation, actually, progressive spheres in relation, but that's covered up virtually across the entire board, especially by also supporters of Trump, who would never, be willing to talk about the difference between overthrow in Iraq and destabilization or rollback in Syria. And so the fact that this book makes that connection between Iraq and Syria, and that being the key military attack on the actual Iraqi oil sector was the pump station to Syria, I think is a crucial lead into the clean break document.
Yeah, for sure. And just to wrap up, it just I reiterate what I said before about the importance of this chapter, and just really taking the findings out of this and the revelations out of it, and combination of allowing it to expand our own understanding of this, and then to open up conversations about the depths of the importance of the revelations, and so it's just, I can't say enough about the importance of the of this of what's been documented here. And so anyway,
All right. Very good. Well, thank you so much, Greg.
all right, thank you, Jeremy.
All right. Thank you, everybody out there. Antedote. We're out.